Welcome to Let's Talk Near Death, the podcast show that talks about life, death, and experiences somewhere in between. I'm Kirsty Salisbury, the host of the show, and I hope you'll join me as I chat to everyday people with not so everyday experiences. You may also wish to join the conversation over in the Let's Talk Near Death online community, which is found at www.letstalkneardeath.com. Membership is free, or you're welcome to upgrade to join the live VIP events, to gain early access to episodes, or to receive extra VIP bonus material. Your support helps me to continue to get episodes out and to help grow the conversation around these types of experiences. But before then, let's talk near death. Welcome back to the Let's Talk Near Death podcast. Today I'm joined by Bud Magagi, author of SOUL AFTERLIFE, Beyond the Near-Death Experience. Bud's journey into his book began back when he was a psychology grad student, and he found himself listening to a man in a hospital bed who had just had a near-death experience. What he heard led Bud to consider the existence of the soul and therefore an afterlife. Bud was raised Catholic and then became a practicing Buddhist, and he tunes into the voices from beyond. And if you've been listening to the podcast for a while now, you'll know just how excited I get when we hear about these voices and how they can guide us. So Bud Magagi, welcome to the Let's Talk Near Death podcast. It's fabulous to have you here.
It's nice to be here, Christy. Thanks for having me.
So you overheard a man in a hospital bed sharing his near-death experience. Was that something that you were familiar with? How did this all begin?
Well, I think it's a foundation piece for me, I think, in terms of, as I relate it back to the book. But let me just back up a little bit further for you to give your listeners an idea of how does this guy end up writing a book about the afterlife? You know, why even tread on those waters? I have my profession is I've run and built and operated multiple psychiatric hospitals for 40 years. And in the course of that, my training was really kind of not offbeat per se, but it was within the realm of the humanistic, holistic psychology and contemplative therapy, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little off to the left anyway of the mainstream kind of ways of dealing with therapy. But in the 80s and 90s, most of the hospitals and facilities, they liked to brand themselves as being programmatically designed for addressing the mind, body, and spirit. And for the longest time, we just kind of marched along with the way in which we were operating these facilities and developing programming, et cetera. And with the mind, there's a ton of therapies out there, and all of them work to some degree for some people and not for others. With the mind, with the pharmaceuticals that we've had with coming out of the 50s and 60s, it does give some relief to people suffering from those kinds of emotional challenges. On the spirit end, however, for the longest time, especially in the hospitals that I was familiar with, the spirit part of it was really ended up being, a local minister coming into the hospital on Sunday to have discussions with maybe some of his congregation or others who were willing to kind of sit for a while. And we just thought that's just the way it happened. And it kind of filled that void, I think, for many administrators and other hospital executives and corporate executives. I was operating a hospital in Dover, Delaware, and I had just a superb clinical director, Dr. McGraw, and she brought it to our attention one day, and she said, we have one or two of these ministers that come in here on Sunday, but they are of this particular bent and this particular congregation. And if we're going to do this, we really should have a list of different kinds of people so that everybody could have their ministry attended to on Sunday if we're going to have this as our program design. So, we have to find, Islamic people and Jewish people and Buddhist people, et cetera, if we're going to have a full list of it. And she said, and complicating this is that even the ones that we have that come in here on Sunday, are they trained to do this? From a clinical perspective, are they trained to do this? This is a therapeutic community we have here. It's a locked facility. And we have, just therapeutic and standards that we have to adhere to. Furthermore, everybody who practices, whether it's on Sunday or Monday through Friday or Saturday, everybody here is credentialed. We don't have these people credentialed. The medical staff have no idea who these people are that are coming in on Sunday. And furthermore, if they are providing interventions with our patient population, how do we document that? And how does that get back to the treatment team in terms of where these patients are going, et cetera, et cetera? So that kind of broke me out of the box a little bit, I think, in terms of when we talk about the spirit of an individual, what really is that, and what should we be doing from a professional standpoint? Mm. It just so happens that my daughter at the time was studying at a Buddhist monastery in Northern Virginia. And Case asked me to go with her, and I went to the Buddhist monastery. And the monk friends that I became familiar with really turned the lights on multiple levels of alternative medicine that could begin to fill the void of all that, through everything from the use of vibration and frequency and color and movement and aromas and breathing and meditation and progressive relaxation, things that would actually be tools that would be able to address the patient population in such a way that you would be able to fill that void of what really is a spirit in those kinds of settings. Well, from that, it gets to a point where you say, well, if we're doing it with the spirit, what really is the spirit? Is the spirit, are we really talking about a soul? And and as you know, and I've listened to some of your podcasts in the past, there's all kinds of debates about that. What is consciousness? What is the soul? Is there one? Isn't there one? Et cetera, et cetera. Being a bit adventurous, I tried to find a way in my mind, is there some way to go to the source? How do you go to the source of that? I have friends down at the University of Virginia at the division that studies the near death and past lives, et cetera, et cetera. And I was visiting with them up towards the northeast portion of Pennsylvania, and they said, there's a woman up here, up in the mountainous region here that a lot of people will go to, but it's so hard to see her. I don't know how we would ever kind of get an appointment, for lack of a better term. I said, well, I'm only here for a couple of days. Why don't we just call her and see what we can do? And that's how I met Charlotte Anama. Now, she's a medium of sort, I guess, psychic, if you want to call it that. The guides themselves call her an oracle. That's why the term is used that in the book. I've never had a reading with Charlotte. I did go up and meet with her. I've met with her a number of times early on. And we had some symmetry in that she was from California. She was raised in a Buddhist monastery where the monks taught her how to fine-tune the skills that she has. But she's very hard to kind of get an interaction with. But we did hit it off. And it was in the course of those discussions that Charlotte and I would have over maybe the first 4, 5, or 6 months that I would travel up there, that this, I don't know what to call it, Kirsty, this energy, this soul, this spirit entered. And Charlotte and I would have these conversations, most of them Buddhist related, And one evening she said to me, you have a guest tonight here. And I said, a guest? And she says, yes, there's a spirit here that wants to be able to kind of communicate with you. And the spirit ended up being, over time, and I'll kind of cut to the chase, quicker scene here. The spirit happened to be identified as he's my primary guide.
Okay.
Yeah. And to a certain extent, when you mentioned to me earlier, were you guided to this place? I actually brought that up in the early dialogue with Charlotte and this guide. That how do I come to sit here in front of this woman and have you be here? How did that happen? And he basically was saying, well, it was a long trek for you, Bud, but you had gone off the guardrails here a little bit, and it's important for me to make sure that you get back onto the guardrails and back into the path that really you were expected to be on here. So that's how that part happens with all of that. The part with widening was what was a recall as we began to have that journey together, particularly in this book, which was about the afterlife. It was the only frame of reference I had, And as I tell the story in the book, I was a young graduate student. I was working at a crisis center not far from a turnpike toll booth, basically, a couple of miles. The Pennsylvania state troopers had announced via pager, that shows you how long ago it was, by pager, they announced that they were inbounding with someone that they thought was a possible drug overdose. And because I had made the call to the trauma unit, they said, well, it's your responsibility to get with the trooper. We expect you to be here when the trooper delivers this patient. And so I hopped into the trooper's vehicle as he whipped by our building, and I noticed that the gentleman that was laying in the back had turned blue, and it was just kind of, as a young guy, it just really freaked me out, you know. Mm. But I watched as they treated him in the ER, and they, the typical protocol was a naloxone injection. They injected Whitney with that anti-antagonistic drug, and within what seemed like a matter of minutes, he sat on the end of the bed and ripped everything out of his body, all the tubes that were delivering fluids, et cetera, and just said, "I'm out of here." You know, and my medical director, who is the in charge of the ER, just looked at me and he said, "Well, but this guy's all yours. He's yours. This is for you and your team over there." So we put Whitney in the tower that day, and I went back that evening, and he was. It's remarkable that I remember some of the finer detail of his face. You know, he was very distant, very dark, very intelligent looking. Not facially, but you could see his mind was working somewhere. And I told Whitney, I said, "Look, if you want to talk, that's fine, but I'm just here to kind of support you, you know, especially this evening, given what happened today." And he never said a word to me. And after about an hour and a half, I got to get up, and he just whispered to me, really. He says, "Do you ever think about dying?" And I said, "No, not very often. I don't think about dying." He said, "Would you like to know what it's like?" And being the age I was, I sat down, I put my notebook aside, and I just listened to him. And he was very animated, not physically animated, vocally animated about what his experience was. And as I recall, and it's been a number of years now, but he recalled very vividly how he left his body, how he physically left his body. And much like some of the other near-death experiences you hear about, he was able to witness what was going on around him. But what was different from some of that was the input that he explained, that he heard everything and felt everything all at once. It was like a massive overload, and it scared him, you know, and as he described it, it was just too much for me to handle. And then the return back to his body. I mean, there's more to the story in detail about all of that he explained, especially the rapidity of it, how rapid it all happened, and how it all seemed to be happening at like super speed for him in terms of what he was seeing and what he was experiencing. And I say in the book, you know, I tell this story not because of what had happened to Whitney or the therapeutic interventions or even the dialogue that happened within his room that evening, but I recall the story because I'm on the verge of entering that world now within the context of this dialogue with this guide, and I don't know how to understand what might happen beyond that. Is that what we experience, you know, and if we did progress further after a death experience, is it similar to what we experienced in the near-death experience? So that's Whitney. You had an interest in what happened to Whitney and why it was that. Whitney kind of laid the foundation for it. It was the only experience I had kind of covering that. After that, it was very different in terms of what, and I learned a lot. I was telling somebody last evening at a podcast, you learn a lot when you're talking to somebody, as hard as this is to say to you right now, when you're talking to somebody who's in the spirit world, that I learned very early on to be very careful about how you phrase your questions.
Right. Okay.
Because they interact differently with you. Let me give you an example, Kirsty. Very early on, when he first appeared, or he appeared for Charlotte, I didn't know what to do. I just I'm a huge skeptic. I was just looking at Charlotte, shaking my head, and
yeah.
But I did go home that night and I Googled, what do you say to a spirit guide? What do you say? And I had a whole list of things. And I wrote the whole list down. Do you have a name? How do we know one another? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it never gave me an idea of how to phrase, because I learned the hard way. They take everything that we say to them, at least Laz did. He takes everything literally. So I had to be careful. And I made huge mistakes over my 10-year voyage with all of this in the 5 books. And let me give you an example. It was one night, I asked him, I said, okay, I know you're not going to be predictive. He's never predictive. He doesn't tell me what to do or how to do anything or whatever. He does kind of lead me to how I need to answer these things in my life. But I said to him, Laz, just give me a break tonight. Just tell me, where am I? I mean, in my life, where am I? And his answer to me, Kirsty, was, you're sitting on the couch. That's where you are.
Probably not what you meant.
I know. So I said, well, okay, I have to start thinking about how I ask these questions, you know. But we progressed from that. I mean, the first book that I wrote about it was called Dirt, Truth, Music, and Bungee Cords, which was really probably the first 2 years that I was meeting with him. It's just a wide variety of questions and dialogue on certain topics. And I didn't want to write the book. I didn't want to write any books. You know, I was thinking to myself, if my colleagues knew I was sitting in this, you know, Oracle's office, talking to a spirit guide, writing books about the afterlife and spirit communications, God knows what they would say about me. But Laz says, you know, you have an obligation. Anybody who has an obligation that's dealing in the transcendent spirituality of what's going on, you have an obligation to share that. Plus, Bud, what people need to know is they need to know that they're not traveling alone. There are spirits like energies like me that are there to help and guide. And he said, you need to write it because people need to know that. Well, Kirsty, to be very honest with you, I said, okay, I can do that. And so for the first half year, I wrote about it as a fiction because I figured, oh, that'll pass. You know, people say, oh, Bud's he's just kind of over there doing this thing as fiction. And I brought part of the manuscript when I was very proud of myself. I brought part of the manuscript in one night, and I was like 70,000 words and all this. And he didn't unload on me. He just said, you've just told everybody, Bud, that I don't exist. That's not the purpose behind this. The purpose behind this is how. And he went on later, years later, to tell me that because I asked him, I said, what's the hardest part of your job? He said, you may relate to this. How can you help or assist somebody who doesn't know that you exist? They have to understand that we exist. There's one chapter in this book, in Afterlife, where my friends and family always ask me, who is Laz? What is this? You know? Well, he's really kind of he's the inspiration sometimes, you know. It's not directive, it's kind of casual inspiration. He's like me, but not like me all at once. He's more like family than he is identical, you know. So the conversations that we have sometimes are like we're sitting at the kitchen table at breakfast talking about a particular topic. He has an interest in the movement, I guess, the spiritual movement, because as I move, so does he. So that's the background on Laz. What was striking about the afterlife, and I want to get to that piece for you because I think your listeners may be more interested in that than kind of the background of how I got to write a book. The opening chapter, it was, I don't want to say radical. I just want to say extraordinarily unconventional in terms of how, you know, the perceptive studies division at UVA have about, you know, we have a certain belief system about, regardless of what our dogmatic framework is, about what may happen to us after we really pass, what really happens over there. And I was of basically the same kind of format, even though, you know, my Buddhist brothers have influenced me a little bit, but that hasn't broken me away completely from some of the belief systems that I have. The first thing he hits me with is, an analogy. And his style with me is with analogies, stories, conversation, hoaxes, because that's me, right? That's how I relate to other people, through stories and analogies, etc. I learn better that way. He hits me with this, what he calls the octopus analogy. Now, I'm looking at your face, Kirsty. You're saying an octopus?
I want to know all about this. Yep.
Yeah, no. Well,
I'm thinking 8.
I had the same look on my face. And because I said to myself, even in the book, I say, just having an analogy that's based on a very odd sea creature makes you just stop dead in your tracks, But the first thing he says to me is, when you die, when you really die, because we talked about near death, I said, look, the only thing I know about where you're going to take me in this particular part of our journey is about near death. And he says, well, that's just what it is. It's near death. He said, in near death, and this may be hard for some people to hear, in near death, you walk along the perimeter of death, is what he said. I said, well, there's an author down here. I don't know. Are you familiar with Michael Newton's work?
Yes, very familiar. Love his work. Okay. Yep, Life Between Lives. Yep.
So then that's my frame of reference too. And so what I loved about his work, and I don't want to divert too far here. What I loved about his work was that it's very comforting. It's very organized, right? It's like everybody has a school, a job, a group, et cetera, and it all looks very kind of mapped out there. And isn't that wonderful? And then we decide to come back and we try new adventures, et cetera, et cetera. And so I said, well, there's an author here, Michael Newton, and he kind of describes it this way. How is that different from where you're going to take me? And he says, well, Michael Newton's here, he said. So he knows what it's like. And that's all he said. He knows now what it's like. So the first thing he says is, when you pass, how do I describe this, Kirsty, without losing your listeners here? We're made of energy. And even in Michael Newton's books, he talks about you have a certain part of your energy that's in spirit now.
Yeah.
Right. So he begins to cross over the line of having the ability for your energy to split. Right? Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, Laz takes it a lot further than that. And he says, when you pass, there's a process. He didn't use the word process. There's things that happen to you. But the other thing that happens to you is, he said, a part of your energy rolls over to other incarnations that you're currently involved in. He says, think of it this way. You're born as a soul. You advance based upon your experiences you have as a soul, regardless of where your incarnation is or how long it is or whatever dimension or whatever it's involved in. Mm-hmm. And that's how you progress based upon what you're learning. So the head of the octopus, he says, it houses, he calls them your mates. He says, they're not soulmates. He says, do not go there with me with this soulmate thing. He says, these are your mates. These are the people who you are learning with, you're growing with. Very similar to Newton stuff.
Would that be like a soul group? Sorry to interrupt you there. Is soul group different to what you're talking about?
Yes, these are individual souls that are in like a learning cluster, he calls them, like a learning cluster group. And Laz is in my cluster. He is over time, he described some of them, not by name, but kind of like what they're like. And as he talked, Laz is really kind of the teacher, the overseer of the group. He's kind of the one that, when you leave part of your energy in the octopus head, as he calls it, analogy, by the way, he's kind of the maintenance guy. He kind of makes sure he's the maintenance guy over there.
I like it.
But so you decide, Kirsty decides, she's in the head of her octopus. She's fully the totality of your energy, right? Everything that you are is there. And you decide, I'm going to come back and I'm going to take this incarnation in New Zealand and I'm going to have these life experiences. And that's going to be one of the tentacles I'm going to drop. That's one of the lifelines or life experiences I'm going to drop. And I'm going to take this portion of my energy with me to kind of try to accomplish whatever that is. And maybe Christy's not a young soul that just takes one voyage. Maybe she takes 3 voyages in different kind of ways. And I'll get into this in a minute with you, but maybe for different, looking at the same thing from 3 different perspectives, both the yin and the yang of it, right? So when Christy passes, part of her energy goes into this process of, and I'll get into this in a minute with you, this kind of very complex process, not scary, but it's complex. But also a portion of Christy's energy would roll over to one of the other incarnations to kind of help out, right? So how did I learn that? I learned that one night when he presented this concept to me, and I had a very hard time with the octopus analogy. I mean, a really hard time with it, because it was anti every ego fiber in my body, that I could be split up, sent to the, God knows where, in multiple incarnations at multiple times and dimensions, and just my head was spinning. So he said, well, let me explain it to you, Bud. Let me give you an idea of a couple of tentacles that you don't have any longer. I said, okay, all right. He says, but I have to ask you a question first. He said, in a word, how would you describe you? What are you? And you may want to ask yourself that question right now. If you had a word to describe, what's your mission here, right? And that's hard to kind of chisel it down, to that. But I'll take a shot with you. And because of what you do for a living, you have to be, if not in whole, but at least in part, a healer of sorts. Would you agree?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm using it only, I may not totally agree, but what he says is that's the sign you wear as a soul. I am studying as a soul to be a healer.
Right. Yep. That makes sense.
So, and as a soul, my responsibility is I have to learn everything there is about being a healer, right? So in part, I have to be both patient and doctor, right? To really understand it, right? I have to be both a good patient and a bad patient, and a good doctor and a bad doctor, to really fully learn everything there is about being a healer at all kinds of levels. So he asked me, and I didn't give him an answer. He gave me that answer. He says, "We call you, Bud, a healer." I said, "Okay, I'll go along with that, because I'm in the world of psychiatry." And although he says, but this incarnation, this Bud Magagi incarnation, its particular, let's say, emphasis is not so much in healing individuals. You try to heal the institutions that the individuals work in. And that was what I do for a living. He says, now, to give you an idea about your other appendages, he said, part of your energy was a monk. And that energy passed a while ago. I won't tell you when, but a while ago. And I thought to myself, and that's kind of odd. And he said, well, the reason it's odd for you, Bud, is because as that rollover I talked about before, right? He said, that energy rolled over to you when you started going to the monastery with your daughter.
Right.
It was familiar to it, so it brought you that. It took you there. He says, now there's other parts of your energy we won't get into because you may not be so interested in all that. So that's the octopus analogy for me. It just had a representation of, that's a way of explaining that we have multiple lives, and the tentacles are just multiple lives, and whether they're similar, same time, different times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So that's that. So the book opens that way. And I actually, in the podcast yesterday, I was asking the interviewer, I said, and she read the whole book, and I said, did it turn you off, the octopus analogy? She says, no, actually, it gave me that frame of reference of multiple lives. Because from there, he gets into, well, let's talk about what happens when you pass. Let's really talk about what happens. And he said, and again, because your energy can split, right? It has that capacity. Here's a little nugget for you that he gave me, because there's a lot of nuggets that aren't in the book. Because I would have these meetings that'd be 3 or 4 hours long, and they're all taped, so I'm thinking someday I'll revisit with them. But he says, when you pass, he says it's not unlike, he calls it the source. He doesn't call it God, he calls it the source of all things. He says, the source can do, you are a component, a very small spark, he used, a very small spark of the source. You are of the source. If the source can be multiple things at multiple times, why can't you? You are of the source. If the source can split itself into all of these other things that it may or may not be, and his version of it is everything is part of the source. So if it can be trees and flowers and horses and grass, et cetera, and they have souls, why can't you, Bud? He says that's the power that the soul has. But in a human incarnation, it's the power that's turned off. But once you leave here, you no longer have a human obligation. You have a soul obligation now. So you have the capacity to split again. Right? So part of your energy goes back to the head to say hello to whoever that's in that little. I always fix. Am I in like a little bucket or something up there? What am I? Yeah.
Yeah. I've got a very visual imagination, so I'm imagining it's in cartoon, and I'm just imagining this little head on the octopus. So I'm with you there.
Yeah. I see myself on a shelf, and Laz is looking over all the things. But part of you goes there. Part of you rolls over to maybe assist or help or guide other incarnations that are currently in process. And then, but the largest portion of your energy starts through a process, and the first process it goes through is, he calls them the 7 senses. You start to review the 7 senses. And the first sense you go through is love. Now, I said, that's odd that you bring that up, Laz, because I don't have nearly the extensive obligation you have to near-death experiences. But what I hear most often is people talking about the sense of love that they feel, right? This overwhelming love kind of thing. He says, well, that's not unusual, because that's the first part that your energy experiences, the love piece, the sense of love. It is the sense that you had here. And in that love sense, you have a review. How did you handle love? What happened to love? Did you cherish love? Did you abuse love? What happened with all that? I said, is that the life review? He says, not necessarily. He says, but we'll get to that. The second sense you experience is fear. It's not fear like I'm afraid of something. It's fear that I'd rather be somewhere, this part of my energy, where I feel more comfortable than what I'm experiencing here.
Interesting.
And I said, well, why? I said, why that? He says, because once you pass, you're aware of everything. I said, what do you mean everything? He says, imagine you having the ability to hear every thought. He says, imagine what it would be like to hear every faucet turned on all at once. He says, that's the vibration and frequency that you're being exposed to. Now, if your vibration, as an example, Kirsty, if your vibration is on a scale of 1 to 10, let's give you an 8, okay? We'll say your vibration is high, it's an 8, okay? Well, you may pass, and on that vibration of fear, you may be able to more quickly handle the absorption of all that. Much what Whitney was talking about. I heard everything, but all at once. You may be able to better navigate that than Whitney, who maybe was a 4. I'm not being cruel. I'm just saying it was a lower vibration because he was a drug addict. So there's fear. After that, there's peace. It's wanting to resolve, right? Wanting to fix. After that, he says, this is not attractive, but every soul has a sense of hate. It's you're so powerful now compared to what you were as in the human shell. You're so powerful. If you wanted to get back to somebody, you could. He says we tend not to, but you could, because you do have resentments for some things. Not maybe a personal resentment that I did not accomplish this or whatever, but it kind of turns on you. After that, he said, the next sense you experience is, he says it's God. He said, no, it's called God connection. It's the sense of, I want to be more than what I was this past incarnation. I want to be more transcendent. I want to aspire to bigger, better things. I want to be able to create more, because now you are free. And if you are a spark of the source has the ability to create. In fact, both you and I and all of your listeners, every day, we're creating things. That's what we do. We create.
Totally.
So the God connection kind of just expands on us in that sense. And then the next one is the interesting one. The next one is, he calls it the series of karmic events.
Oh, wow.
That's where you if I had to choose one, that's where you have your life review. And that's where you feel, this kind of freaked me out a little bit. Well, actually, a lot of this freaked me out, but he said, he used a classic example. He said, if you were a bully in a schoolyard, during this sense, you are feeling the opposite of what you did as the bully, right? So you're feeling it now. You're resolving that karma. You're feeling that. Not only that, but you're hearing everything, every thought everybody had about you as that bully. And I said, well, what's happening there? He said, it's like this, Bud. Imagine that every time you do something that is, let's say, negative, right? You give yourself a brick. Every time you do it, I trip you as you're walking down the hallway. I give myself a brick. I slam the door in your hand. I give myself another brick. He says, eventually, some of you, he says, you have so many bricks, you've created a whole wall for yourself. And all that has to be adjusted in some form or fashion in order for you to move out of that sense. The inability to move out of that sense, he says, that's your hell. The last one is the cool one. The last sense is the overseer. That's the part of your energy that has the responsibility to take all these other 6 senses and pull them all back together so they don't run amok. It's the one that kind of pulls it all back and says, everything has been cleansed in such a way that we may now have the ability to move fully back into the head of the octopus. Because only then, once we cleanse, this is his words, can we design an incarnation, a new incarnation. So that's chapter. I'm only at chapter 2, and I'm going.
Oh my goodness! And I already have so many questions for you.
Because I'm driving home at night. I call my friends. I say, you want the ones I trust anyway. I said, you won't believe what he said. I mean, how do you write about this?
Yeah.
That some people don't think you're really falling off the wagon here. But it makes sense. What helped me was, my Buddhist teachings really kind of helped, because it framed it for me in these 2 ways. One, as Buddhists, the people who follow Buddhist philosophy, they firmly believe that we're far more than we understand that we are. We're so much more than this.
Yeah.
So that fit into it, and that there is no permanent, let's say, heaven or hell. It would be inhuman to kind of go either way with it, But what we have to do is we have our karmic responsibilities in order to resolve in terms we move forward. Now, if some of your readers pick up the book or listen to it on audio or whatever, I mean, it gets more complicated. but understandable because he marches me around. His style with me is very interesting because the topic may be senses, and he'll kind of march me around, and I'll have 1,000 questions, and that's all I'm doing in the book is questioning. Much like you're going through your head right now, I would question all these things, and I would love for you and any reader to send me any questions you have that you would have asked differently. But he marches you around, and then it kind of hit, and then it comes home, you know. So then he goes from there. I said, well, what do we want? And it almost ends like this all the time. The dialogue, the narratives, and a lot of people have asked me, why did you write the book in narrative form? You know, it's just questions and answers, Socratic. Like I said, well, there are some personal reasons for that. I said, but I can tell you this, when I started it, after I got shut down on the fiction thing, I started and said, you know what I really want? I want people to take the voyage with me. And the only way for that to happen is if I can design some way where they can be a co-pilot, you know, kind of imagine you're in the room with me, you know, and you have the ability to sit with somebody who knows you better than you know yourself. And it's inescapable. You cannot BS your way out of anything. And he or she will not give you the answer. You're forced to answer it yourself. Or you get up and leave on the other. So I wanted a co-pilot. I also wanted people to understand that if you travel down this particular transcendent spiritual journey, right, that this is just an author taking his journey. It has no bearing on anybody's religious beliefs or one way or the other. I don't challenge any of that. I just said, I'm just having this experience. And to a certain degree, it's extraordinarily challenging for me. And I wonder, is it challenging? If you did this, would it be challenging for you or what? And then the third part is, people would say to me, well, you know, Bud, you're sitting with a psychic. Aren't you skeptical? I said, I'm skeptical of everything. I said, anybody who's in any spirituality environment, I don't care where you are, if you're not skeptical, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
Everything everything that's in the spiritual realm requires some leap of faith for all of us, right?
Yeah.
Even if I'm sitting in a Roman Catholic church, I have to take a leap of faith that what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing, what I'm experiencing, what I'm smelling it all makes sense. So I wanted to have an idea. If you had this kind of experience sitting with, not a better term, an oracle and having a guide there, et cetera, this is what that experience was like. So it's kind of written in three kind of different fashions about that. I wanted to be as unclouded as I could make it of habit and bias. So I just wrote it. It's raw. I just wrote it, you know. And so the editors kind of do a little massaging only because they wanted to kind of read right for somebody, because they said, but they're not in there with you. So the colloquialisms are different, you know, for some people. And because it's coming through Charlotte, she has her colloquial kind of representation of what she's hearing and as she delivers it, et cetera, et cetera. And the other unique part is that I'm not big on channeling. I know very little about it, basically, other than my experience. I have done my research. I know that there are other things, people that challenge, like Esther Hicks and Paul Selig and some others. And I've witnessed them on YouTube, et cetera. That's not what Charlotte does. And in those instances, I'm sure they're valuable to people. I'm sure that has some value. This is my guy. It's not a universal guy. This is my guy talking about, you know, Bud, I've been hounding you down for years. I mean, if you don't, this is a true story. If you don't get your control, these control issues that you have under your belt somehow, you're going to have a rough time over here. Because if you come over here thinking that all you are and all you're made up is your feelings and your thoughts, your memories, you're going to have a really hard time, because you have to find a way to balance all this out. So I thought, well, I'm out of the woods. I got through the senses. That's kind of, you know, I understand that. I may not agree with all of it. I can understand it. And I can understand that any of the willful acts that I have in the course of my life may have to have some resolution in form or fashion when I get over there. Okay, I get it. He says, well, let's talk about, I said, what do we talk about next time? He says, I want to talk about breath. And here again, I'm driving home. Kirsty said, "You won't believe what he wants to talk about next thing. He wants to talk about breath. I have no idea what this is. I have no idea I'm going to write about this." I'll cut quickly to the chase here with this. In his mind, and those who want to read that particular chapter, breath for him is God, basically. But the way he represents it makes so much sense in the storyline that he gives about it. He says, once you're released, your energy is released. Because I ask, what's the first thing you feel? I mean, are you terrified? Or, he says, well, no, the first thing you feel is the release. You're free. You're no longer encapsulated within this shell. You are in your normal state. My Buddhist brothers call it brilliant sanity. You're in a state of brilliant sanity, your original form, the way you truly are. And he says, so what you feel is you feel release. He said, do you feel remorse or anything? He says, no, most of you feel the excitement of it all. Right? He says, but you're fluid. You're like water. You're fluid. You're moving. I said, why am I moving? Why is everything moving? He says, because that's what souls do. Their job is to move. Energy seeks out other energy always. And that's quantum physics, quantum mechanics. Right? I said, okay, if that's true, then explain the tunnel to me. People in near-death experiences talk about a tunnel.
Yeah.
What is that? He says, well, I can tell you what it isn't. And I said, okay, what isn't it? It's not a doorway, it's not a portal to someplace. He says, and they feel a pull, and you've probably heard some people feel a pull somewhere.
Absolutely.
He says, okay. He says, let me talk about the pull first. He says, the pull is the vibration that, let's say, in front of you. Let's go back to you, Kirsty, and say you're a vibration at 8. Okay, what's pulling you is other vibrations in the spirit world of 8. That's what's pulling you. It's pulling you to that side of things, because like attracts like. Right? Okay, I'll buy that piece. But what's the tunnel? And he says, it's very simple. The tunnel is your aura spinning at the vibration that you have in that incarnation. And attached to that aura, Bud, are all the things you've done. He says it's a storage. Your aura is an energy field storage tank. Not unlike your human shell is a storage tank for everything you experience in human form. So what breath does, he says, when you pass, you're searching for breath. And I'm thinking like human, like breath, am I unable to breathe?
Breathing in and out, yeah.
He says no, because breath can provide the dam. He says, look at it this way. Suppose for a minute that soul energy is like water, right? It's moving, flowing. How do you stop the water? You build a dam. He says, breath is the dam. One, you need to have form, and you need to have a dam to reincarnate. What breath does for you, what source, God, does for you, is provide the mechanism for you to stop the movement and prepare for your next incarnation. So I had a quasi hard time with that chapter, the breath chapter.
Yeah.
And then I said, go ahead, if you have questions.
Are you saying that that's our body, the dam?
Yes.
Our physical body, because then the energy we've still got the energy within the body, but we're not like the water free moving around. I can't even put that into words.
Yes.
Is that what you were saying?
Yes. That source, breath, stops your energy so that you can incarnate in this shell.
Right. Yeah.
And then
I thought that's what you were saying.
The shell basically acts as it's like the vessel, right?
Yeah.
Almost like I'm thinking about, I'm not a big movie buff, but I'm thinking like an avatar. I'm thinking, he said like an avatar kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he kind of shakes his head. He doesn't know what an avatar is. He didn't see the movie. So the next, he says that, well, in order to fully understand this, now you're going to have to understand the 7 heavens and the 7 hells.
Okay.
I said, okay. So I went to my, I have a very dear Buddhist friend. He's in the book. His name is Kenshin. Kenshin's an abbot for a very small rural Buddhist monastery about 3 or 4 hours from my home. And with Kenshin, oftentimes I've called him when I have these kinds of dilemmas, and knowing that I was going to have to deal with this 7 heaven, 7 hell thing. I called Kenshin. I said, I need to speak with you because I'm going to have this discussion, and I want to get your 2 cents on it. And so I went out to the monastery to meet with Kenshin. And for any of those listeners who want to visit monastery Buddhist abbots, the only time to meet with them is right after their morning tea, which is about at 4:30 in the morning. So please be advised about that part. Yeah, but and being with Kenshin is very cautiously relaxing. I mean, these individuals, I don't know what frequency they're at. I mean, but they're just this a sense of calm and kind of interpersonal guidance that they have, which is really envious. And so he says, I understand that you want to talk about heaven and hell. He says, but I also understand you always come here with the answers you already know. And I'm thinking to myself, am I dealing with another Laz here or what? So, but he said, I want to read you a story. He said, I want to read you a story. It's an old Buddhist story, and it says it's how we approach heaven and hell. And he tells a story of a samurai warrior who goes to this a sitting monk who's meditating, and he asks the monk, he says, I want to know the answer to heaven and hell. And the monk looks up at him and starts degrading the guy and saying, why would I give a worm like you, a disgusting person like you, the answer to what heaven and hell is? Get away from me. I don't want to talk to you anymore. And the samurai draws his sword and begins the process of trying to behead the monk. And the monk looks up at him and says, now that's hell. And with that, the samurai drops his sword and he goes to his knees and asks for forgiveness from the abbot. And the abbot looks up at him and says, and that's heaven. And so what Kenshin was really saying to me was that, heaven and hell is what we make of it by what we create and what we do and what our actions really are. And he says to me as I'm leaving, he says, Bud, you're an interesting character. He says, you're the kind of guy, you need maps and GPS and things to find your way through life, when really, you already know it. You just haven't taken the time to, and this is Kenshin's main thing, you haven't taken the time to just stop and breathe, because that's where your answer is. And I thought to myself, I just finished this thing with breath, and he's talking about me breathing.
Stopping and breathing.
Exactly. I'm going, am I completely insane here?
Yeah.
So just to cut to the quick scene on heaven and hell, he as I met with Laz, what he did was that I asked him first, I said, you're using the number 7 a lot. I said, I don't watch too many TV shows or something, but I said, there's some significance with 7. And he said, 7 has a vibration. He says, we don't say 7 over here, but you guys say 7 there. But what it has a certain vibration to it. It really is the vibration of the universe, he said. So we use it to kind of frame it for you because you have a certain sense of vibration. But here's what he did with that. He said, you go through your chakra in accordance with the 7 senses. So you start with your root chakra, right? And within your root chakra, you personally experience in the soul world each of those 7 senses within that root. The root chakra being kind of the lower, it's really kind of like, I don't have a book with me here, but it's the partly the love chakra. So how did you handle that in relation to all of those senses? The love sense, the fear sense, the peace sense, the hate sense, et cetera. And you don't move up to the next chakra until you have cleaned that out. And that's your review. And so you go from one to the other to the other. I noticed that in some of the work that you've done, Kirsty, that you're interested in the Akashic records, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And that's really your forehead. Right?
Yeah.
That's your forehead. Well, the same thing would happen there when you get to that chakra. You're dealing, and because at that chakra you're all knowing. You know the Akashic records. You know the present, past, future, etc., etc. You know space time, but you still work through each of those senses within that chakra until you finally have cleansed yourself. So, and I say to him, well, that certainly is a chore. But my interest isn't so much in knowing it, Laz. What do I do about it? I mean, you're telling me all these things. What do I do about all of it? And he says that the thing you do is I'll cut to the end of the book. At the end of the book, right near the end of the book, he shows Charlotte a key, like an old-fashioned medieval key that you would put in an armoire or something like that. And Charlotte says, "But this is really odd. He's showing me a key, and now he's showing me a wreath." And I said, "Well, Laz, what's this all about?" He says, "Bud, you've always learned better through imaging, and I'm giving you these images, but I'll tell you what they are next time when we write the final chapter of the book." And the key represented awareness. He says, the key to all of this has always been your ability to be aware that it exists. If you know it exists, you're going to be better able to navigate all of this. It's not that hard. If you have done your work here in this form, and removed as many bricks as you can while you're here, it's a quicker pace. And I said, well, how much time are we talking about? And much like I've heard in some of your other podcasts, people say that there's no time really, not like clock time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And he says it doesn't matter here. He says you're there as long as you need to be there. So, questions?
So many questions. Thank you so much, Bud. You've been on quite a journey, quite an adventure. I can see that there would be definitely some struggle in integrating everything that you've been hearing, receiving these messages coming through. So thank you for sharing that. I want to start right back at the beginning. You said the beginning of your book, you're talking about the octopus. Now I see in my head, like I said, I've got a very cartoon visual way of seeing things. I see the octopus. I see almost like the little gatekeeper in the head that you're talking about, like the chief. I don't know your words, but the chief one looking over everything. And then we would incarnate. So, for example, we would incarnate. One of the tentacles would be our incarnation. So that's not 100% of us that comes into this incarnation. And that is a concept that I have looked into quite significantly. And that does seem to be something which really resonates with me, is that we can be incarnating in different places at different times, but all at the same time.
Right.
I'm a little bit stuck here on the octopus. So maybe that's just me and the way that my mind works, my mind blocks. Is the octopus significant to we have potentially 8 lifetimes going on all at the same time, or has 8 got nothing to do with it? Can we have a 4-legged octopus tentacle? Yes. They're not even legs, are they? Yes. You know what I mean.
As a matter of fact, later, I mean, there's a couple. There's a reason he uses the octopus, by the way, as an analogy. Yeah. I'll tell you that in a minute. But he goes on to explain that a young soul, let's say a new soul, a young soul, he says typically drops one tentacle. And again, that's the analogy of tentacle, and will take a massive amount of energy with it because it's really trying to learn as much as it can as a young soul. He says, as you get to more advanced souls, they're more adventurous. So they may have, 2 or 3 or 4 tentacles drop. The hard thing for me with all that is all time is happening now in his world.
Yeah.
So even though you and I may have dropped 8 tentacles, and 3 of them at this moment in time, 3 of them may have already kind of ended, but in some other time they're going on. I mean, it's very hard for me to grasp onto all of that, and that's the that's the complexity of all of it that he really gets into. The reason, this is basically at the end of the book too, the reason he used the octopus, and he says there's a reason I used it, and here's the reason. That if you're lucky enough, and he says, by the way, there's a number of us that never get off a tentacle. That we that we get caught in what he calls an evolutionary loop. Because, and not blaming anybody, it's because of the absence of awareness. We don't know the knowledge that we can get off of this. Also, interestingly, as an example, Christy, if you are one tentacle, right? There's really, although we are one entity, there's really three portions of us on that tentacle. There's a higher portion of you, a lower portion of you, and then you, right? And people talk about that higher self, lower self, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The reason he uses the octopus is that when you are, as a soul energy, completely cleansed, as he calls it, having moved through the seven senses, the seven, all that, and you're back in with your mates, right? Your whole energy. There isn't anything you cannot, there's no doubt in you about what you can do. And he said, that's the same as the octopus. Even though the octopus, Bud, is not evolutionary as advanced as you are, it has no doubt about what it can do. It can change colors. It can change environments. It can grow a leg because it never had any doubt. And that's why I use that analogy. Because when you are in the head of the octopus, you have no doubt. He said it is the human experience that kind of brings up your doubt. And what brings it up is your ego. You know, your ego's inability, refusing to believe that there's anything beyond what I obviously or superficially see in the world. You know, he did a little exercise. He was always famous for little exercise. So he started one chapter where he said, I want you to imagine you walk into a room and you see a lower version of yourself sitting in a chair over there. That version of you doesn't have all your advanced degrees. You know, I have a master's and doctorate and all that kind of crazy. Doesn't have any of that stuff. How would you consult that part of your energy? What would you say to that part of your energy that would help that part of your energy along? And we went through the whole thing, and I thought there were a lot of good answers, you know, and I was working to get an A, but I don't know whether I got one or not. But we talked about that, and they said, now imagine you walk into the same room and you see a higher version of yourself. What would you say to that version of yourself? And again, we went through the whole dynamic of it, and he took me around the hedge as I described you before. And then he says, now, which one of those versions, the higher, the lower, or the one you perceive as yourself, the energy to yourself, which one's in more danger here of missing the step? And I said, well, I would think it would be the lower version because it wouldn't be as equipped or whatever, et cetera, et cetera. He said, no, because all three versions are you. You're not perceiving the obvious. Your mind's like a battery. It has two sides to it, a high and a low. What gets you through life with awareness is the ability to balance all of that. So it is the awareness of our existence and our creations, but it's also balancing out, knowing that we have a higher and lower that are all working at the same time. You know, so
that is so interesting.
It is interesting
because I've never really thought about it like that. You know, I'm aware we've got our higher self. I'm aware. Right. I don't really think about a lower self too much because I feel like, well, the lower self, I've got to where I am. I'm in my present. But the balancing piece there, the higher, the lower, I'm going to have to think on that for a while because that is really interesting to me and how that can influence the way that we perceive things, how we see ourselves, everything really.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
The tentacles, you may have actually just answered this as you were talking. My question after that was, do we have to have 8? Can we have different amounts of tentacles? Was then, can we grow them? Are there some shorter, some longer? Do we come into one incarnation and over time it gets longer as we have the experiences, as we learn things? But then you did say at some point that we can grow because we're not limited. We're completely open. So yeah, very, very interesting. And then I want to go back to the soul group question that I originally had. You were talking about soul groups. I'm aware I'm jumping all over too.
No, that's okay.
Because when you said octopus, I thought, oh yeah, maybe that's like the soul groups. Each tentacle represents an individual person.
Right.
And then within that tentacle, maybe we've got other tentacles coming off because we're all incarnating in different places.
Right.
The soul guide, you said we all have a soul guide. So like you were able to connect with yours.
Right.
How easy is that for everyone else? And yeah, I'll let you do that question first, then I'll come back to my soul group question after that. I've got to slow down.
How easy is it? Is that the question?
Oh gosh, now it's just, this is what I do, Bud. I'm so sorry. Can we all connect to our soul guide easily?
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I think because and let me just be very honest with you. I'm going to see Charlotte in June again. We're writing a sixth book together, and I'll
wow.
kind of share that. I'll share that with you. But even now, as I think about kind of going back up there to kind of continue to work on that, what comes up in me is all the skepticism. Again, it's kind of continual loop of all of it. Here's what I told a friend this morning. I think, and this is part contemplative therapy, a little bit, self-observation and evaluation. Regardless of how you have an experience like that, you have a choice. Do you believe the source of the information, or do you believe the information? And does it make a difference for you? And even though I can walk away from those tapes, and the tapes allow me to kind of amputate those feelings I have about the skepticism, in the end, the information is extraordinary. Whether I choose to believe all of it, that's a whole nother issue. I could get wrapped up, and I've had people tell me, well, Bud, this is just all BS for you because of the psychic and the guides and all that kind of stuff. And I tell them, well, yeah, I mean, I could certainly look at it through that lens and say, the source of the information is really unusual, atypical, unorthodox, whatever you want to say about it. My decision is how much of it do I want to absorb and believe in? So I don't know. Here's what I do know, because we talked about this one time many years ago, because I had such a high degree of skepticism, not only of all mediums, but Charlotte in particular, and she knew it. I mean, we were very candid about it. It started from the get-go. And he described it to me this way. And he said, everybody has had the capacity to have some kind of, whatever you want to call it. He doesn't use our words, psychic ability, let's say psychic abilities. He says, here's the difference. Some people, they may imagine that having those intuitive abilities is like a pool of water. Some people have the ability to stick their toe in that water and receive a minimal amount of information. Some people can go up to their knees, some people up to their waist. And then he says, and people like Charlotte are completely submerged in it, because she sees them and does all kinds of crazy stuff. He says, it really depends upon all of that. He said, the lower versions of all that, the people with the toes in the water and stuff. And I said to Charlotte, what is he talking about? She says, I think he's talking about like when you go to like psychic shows or, fairs or something like that, or somebody going to read cards or stuff like that. He says, when you go to someone like that, what they're reading, he says, you have to understand you are a human energy. So your aura is always there. Like he talked in one chapter, I can't remember which one it was, but he talked about how we exchange information just based upon the energy that goes back and forth. We don't have to say a word to one another. And he talked about if you have past a magical person and you just touch them on the shoulder, that magical person knows that you have something special in you. Whereas you could do the same thing to somebody in a mall and they just say, hey lady, don't bump into me again, But he says, when you go to those people who have a toe or ankle in the water, what they're reading is, you're like a billboard, he said. They're reading the obvious that's on your aura. And that's why they pick it up very quickly. He says, to get to the depth of it, of who you really are as an energy, you're going to need somebody that's up to their waist in chest and water. So how do you find somebody? Is that the kind of original question? How do I find somebody that has the capacity to attach to somebody who is my guide to the extent that that's believable, right? And believable for me always had a couple measurements to it. One was that, what am I learning? And is it exclusively directed to me? Can I identify that it's exclusively directed to me? And is it always positive? He's never said a negative word to me, So I don't know how you do that, in the midst of that pool of available resources that are out there to kind of access. I don't know the answer to that. I was fortunate, I guess, that because the connectivity to me and Charlotte was not based upon her psychic abilities per se. It was based upon the fact that we both had monastery experiences that we were sharing with one another. We didn't expect him to show up. She never expected him to show up. As a matter of fact, she says, this is very unusual because this doesn't happen very often. And she says, some people come to me and she has, I'll tell you a quick, I hope she's okay with me saying this. I think she's okay with me saying it. I've driven up to her place and there's been 2 or 3 black Chevy Suburban SUVs out front with American flags on it. So she's that exclusive. And we just joined together because of our monastery experiences. I didn't want to have the experience. I think people say to me, well, ghosts, goblins, etc. I said, look, I was very emphatic from the beginning with both her and him. I don't want to see anything. I don't want to talk to anybody. Charlotte says, well, but you may have the ability to build your own ability to see him. I said, I don't want to see him. You can see him for me. Why would I want to kind of wake up in the middle of the night and have him standing at the foot of my bed,
Isn't that funny? Because it's usually the other way around. People want to develop, they want to see things, and they're trying to find people that can help them to connect more. And yeah, you're the opposite. I don't want to see it. I don't want to know. You do the connection piece.
But again, for your listeners and the readers, etc., my attachment to it is the information, is the information for me believable to the point where I'm willing to entertain modifying any component of the belief system that I may have. He shared with me in the very end of that book, this past book, Afterlife, he shared with me, he was talking about duality, and it's kind of hard to explain this. He's really heavy into the natural elements, especially water, because we are 73% water. Right. And so he was talking about, when you look in the mirror, do you really see what's there? He says, most of you look in the mirror and make sure that your hair is right, He says, but are you really looking? Because if you're having a bad day and you look in the mirror, that image of you is energy. And that image is receiving that bad day. And you're really creating almost like a double of you, not physically, but the energy is kind of moving that way. And he says, because I want to share something with you. He said, you have 2 guides. You have 2 positive guides. And you have 2 negative guides. Not evil. Their responsibility is that you learn the yang of life.
Right.
Much like my responsibility is that you learn the yin of life. Here's this may blow your mind. If I haven't done it already, this may blow your mind.
Yeah.
Okay, he said, I told you the key. I said, what's the wreath? He says, the wreath is, you are the beginning, you are the end, you've always been, you always will be. It will always be. I said, okay, that's mumbo jumbo to me. We talk like brothers, I told you. Like a kid. Now, come on, I'm not afraid of cursing with him. That's mumbo jumbo. What do you mean by that? He says, okay, let's go back to the analogy, Bud. Imagine that your octopus is a college within the university of existence. It's the one college. Now let's imagine for this evening's discussion, both you and I are in the College of Healing, right?
Yeah.
That's our curriculum. We have, you get a syllabus, right? You get the syllabus, the curriculum. So you and I have to learn absolutely everything there is about healing, regardless of what it is. We have to learn of it from, this is kind of a little freaky, every sex, male, female, every race, black, white, brown, yellow, every physical handicap, everything. We have to learn every aspect of it. Patient and doctor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the College of Healing, Bud. Now imagine that all the octopuses of the university are connected with their tentacles. So it's like a web, it's like a spider web of octopuses that go on forever. He says, so, I'm going to be hypothetical now. So you and Kirsty are in the College of Healing. And with regards to how many incarnations it may take the two of you, you graduate from healing. Well, where do you go next? Artisan, teacher, warrior? Which next college are you going to be in where you have to now learn everything there is about that particular thing? He says, and that's the wreath. It goes on forever because that's the purpose of it. The purpose of it is because he said, there's no time, and all time is happening now, even though you may have a particular energy soul that's stuck on some god-awful tentacle somewhere, completely unaware and unable to get off that tentacle, eventually that soul will, because the time doesn't matter here. And eventually that soul will kind of move to its next tentacle, and then eventually maybe it'll graduate to the head of its octopus, and then it will have another incarnation and kind of move within that college, within the university, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He says it goes on forever. He says, isn't it amazing, he said, Bud, that the teachings you have there as you die, you think, he says, it's interesting, you call it passing. He says, you see your pass. He said, it says like a grade. It's like in the college, we're talking like a grade. You want a grade? He says, you die and you think it's heaven, hell, that's it, it's done, we're done. He says, and you really just scratched the surface of the existence of a soul. So it's kind of the depth of it, Kirsty, kind of, it really, even trying to explain it to you tonight, as I'm explaining it to you tonight, I'm thinking to myself, oh God, I hope she doesn't think I'm completely crazy, because, but that is the experience of it. And as you weigh it all, the challenge is which pieces of these, at this point in time of my existence, which pieces fit and which pieces don't.
Yeah.
You know, did I have a hard time with the multiple guides? I was surprised they even had one, you know?
Yeah.
But here's, go ahead.
No, you carry on. You finish. Well,
I think at the very end of things, and I'll give you a final octopus component of the octopus analogy. You know, if you're in the head of the octopus, you know, you've kind of graduated off your tentacles. You're back in the head of the octopus. You're contemplating what incarnation you want to have. Because you're completely cleansed, you have a lot of choices. If you're not completely cleansed, you may just kind of get the next choice that's in the line, you know. But you're in there with your buds. You guys have been studying for who knows how many millennium together, you know, you and your 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people, right? And then he says, but let me tell you how all this works. He says, because we're all in this together. He says, do this for me. He says, hold out your hand. He says, now, each of these fingers have a purpose. This one is for hitchhiking a ride. This one's for pointing a direction. This one's for sending somebody a very bad message. This one you put your rings on, and this one you use for balance. He says, you have all those little things. He says, now, do this for me. He says, close your fist. Imagine the power of that now, of those 5 things. He says, that's the power of the octopus. When you're back together, when your tentacles are all back together, and you're back together with your mates, that's the power that you have. He says, but let's do a hypothetical. He says, because this happens. Suppose for a moment, one of your mates has a tentacle out there that's not been resolved yet, that just goes rogue. and creates what you guys down there call the butterfly effect. And the ripple of that rogueness ripples through the entire universe of time and lives, he says, and comes and smacks the 5 of you dead in the head. He says, and you and Kirsty were ready for your next incarnation, and now that's gone because of this rogue. Because all the energy we're all energy, we're all interrelated, we're all connected with everything. And he says that's the challenge. And the challenge becomes, are you aware of that necessarily, to the extent that not only can you navigate this incarnation for yourself in order to try to just, as my father used to say, just be a good citizen, if nothing else. My dad, make your bed in the morning and be a good citizen for God's sake, If you can do that, maybe you'll have the ability to kind of better navigate it. He talked a lot about how you make your choices for the next incarnation, especially if he calls it whole. Whole means cleansed, means you've gone through the 7 sevens and you've pretty much cleaned up everything. Yeah. He also made a statement to me the last time, not 2 times before the last time. He made a statement. He said that there are powers that be. There are creators, plural. Creators. In other words, Michael Newton will talk about a bit of a hierarchy, right? He talks about colors, right? Now, I kind of use that as the example of what he was saying. But if you have the same capacity as the source, then you have the capacity to create, right? So there are creators, right? And sometimes we may create certain situations or scenarios for reincarnation that maybe aren't as favorable. But the intention is to learn yin and yang. He says, there's time when some of the creators they'll allow evil to come back exactly intact. I said, why would they do something like that? It's kind of like you hear that with some dogmatic groups who'll say, why would God, do this or that? Why would God create these kind of bad things? Well, part of it, I don't want to go too far by saying it's intentional, but it allows a learning to occur. I asked him one time, sometimes my editors kind of yell at me sometimes, because sometimes in my questioning, I'll jump around because my mind is just, if you imagine sitting there and saying, what's my next question? I jumped around one time. I said, look, I have to kind of stop you for a minute to kind of just make sense. I don't mean to divert you, but I have a question. I said, why would a young soul, decide to come back and leave right away, like an infant? Why would that happen? What's the purpose behind that? Because I hear that a lot. I've heard that a lot with patient population over the course of the years. And he said, you have to understand something first. He said, the way you as a human interpret that is different than we interpret that over here in the spirit world. I said, well, how does it make sense to that for me? He said, okay, there could be some learning to the people around that soul, that they were supposed to learn something as a result of that early departure. But more than likely, Bud, it's the soul who's doing it. The soul doesn't want to come back. They didn't like the body they were assigned or whatever they were assigned. Just in some cases, some souls come back not completely cleansed. They may actually have an illness that they didn't resolve for themselves, and they come back under that ill. He says there's all kinds of variables. He says, additionally, you may find this interesting. He says some groups of souls will volunteer for an event that's going to be a learning event for the masses.
I've heard about that. Yeah.
And that makes sense to me. Like, how could that happen? He says, but it's because it's all about learning. That's why you're here. You're here to learn.
Yeah.
You're not kind of blindly going through the day.
Yeah. It's so interesting. You have sparked so many thought processes for me. I love it. I want to take the conversation. We'll actually probably just take it over to the VIP group because I haven't quite got all of my questions out there. I want to come back to the soul group. I want to talk about the roles within soul groups and hierarchy that we've touched on. I've written a little list here. I wanted to go back to talking about that tunnel, the aura within the tunnel.
Yeah.
So we'll jump over to the VIP group and do that. So if you're listening and you want to hear that part of the conversation, you are very welcome to join us in the VIP area. And Bud, thank you so much for everything that you've shared. This has been one of our longer episodes, which I love. And you've just had so much learning take place. You've written these books. There's another one on the way. We're going to put the links to your book in the show notes. Let people know how they can get in touch with you. Go and grab the book. I know that definitely there's going to be a lot of really important information in there, really useful, practical stuff as well, because I can hear the depth at which your research has been. It's a spiritual research, but I can hear just so many parts of life and living and death and dying that you've tapped into. So I want to thank you for your time. This has been absolutely wonderful. And I hope that your book, you get lots of people looking at that and we can just start to really grow our thoughts and our processes and understand a lot more around life, but also death.
Yeah, I'll leave your listeners with this. At the very end of everything, and usually he says this at the very end of not so much every book, but he's always very consistent with saying, why I'm here for you, Bud, is to make sure that to the extent possible, you're as sympathetic, less flawed, and more courageous than you've been up to this point. That's why we exist, is to make sure that you all become more sympathetic, less flawed, and more courageous. And I find that there's a little bit of that kind of settles with me. It settles the whole.
Yeah.
Is it the person or is it the method by which I'm learning all this? So thanks for having me, Chris. You're a joy to be with, and I hope it's valuable up to an extent. It is different, and so I wouldn't want your listeners to think anything other than that. It is not. It's very atypical, but sometimes learning the variabilities of things allows us to kind of reach out further than where we've been before. So,
absolutely, Bud. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me, Chris.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Let's Talk Near Death podcast. Don't forget you can join the free online community over at www.letstalkneardeath.com, and I look forward to sharing another episode with you soon.